She stole my life's research and presented it as her own at the conference we both attended. What she didn't know was that I had embedded a subtle watermark in those files that would expose her fraud to the entire scientific community. Let me tell you how I orchestrated the perfect academic vindication. The grand ballroom of the Westmore Hotel felt particularly stifling that evening, despite its soaring ceilings and elegant crystal chandeliers that cast prismatic reflections across the gathered scientific elite. I'd spent 3 years developing my research on neural pathway regeneration, meticulously documenting every breakthrough and setback in my quest to help patients with spinal injuries regain mobility. The International Neuroscience Summit deserved nothing less than my complete dedication. It represented the culmination of countless sleepless nights, failed experiments, and finally, the breakthrough that could change thousands of lives. The champagne flutes clinked around me as colleagues exchanged pleasantries, their conversations a melodic hum of scientific terminology and polite academic rivalry. I smoothed down my carefully chosen blazer, the dark blue one reserved for special occasions, and checked the presentation notes on my tablet one final time. My session wasn't scheduled until tomorrow morning, but preparation had always been my anchor in the tumultuous waters of academic research. The ornate doors to the ballroom swung open with practiced precision, revealing the familiar silhouette of Dr. Rebecca Lawrence, her confident stride carrying her through the crowd like a ship's bow cutting through calm waters. Her research assistant Michael followed close behind, carrying what appeared to be presentation materials. Something about their synchronized entrance sent a whisper of unease through me, though I couldn't immediately identify why. Dr. Lawrence, the conference organizer's voice carried across the room. We're so pleased you've agreed to present tonight's keynote. The committee was absolutely fascinated by your submission on neural pathway regeneration techniques. The crystal flute nearly slipped from my fingers, the champagne inside trembling like the sudden uncertainty in my chest. Neural pathway regeneration? That was my research. My submission had been scheduled for tomorrow's morning session, not as tonight's keynote. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as I watched Rebecca accept congratulations from colleagues who had no idea they were praising her for my work. My heart hammered against my ribcage with such force I was certain others could hear it above the ambient conversation. 3 years of research, the meticulous documentation of my novel approach to stimulating dormant neural pathways. How could she have accessed it? My mind raced through possibilities while my body remained frozen in place. The champagne now, forgotten in my white-knuckled grip. Rebecca's gaze swept the room in a practiced arc, momentarily locking with mine. The flicker of triumph in her eyes confirmed what my racing heart already knew. This was no coincidence, no administrative error. She had deliberately taken my research and positioned herself to present it before I could. In the cutthroat world of academic publishing, being first meant everything. Second presentations became mere footnotes, their presenters reduced to also-rans regardless of who had done the original work. The conference hall suddenly felt like it was contracting. Around me, the elegant moldings and artistic lighting fading into the background as my focus narrowed to Rebecca's satisfied smile. She raised her glass in a subtle toast before turning to respond to a question from the department chair of neuroscience at Harvard. The casual confidence of her gestures suggested she had no concerns about potential consequences. Why would she? By tomorrow morning, the scientific world would associate this groundbreaking research with her name, not mine. I carefully placed my untouched champagne on a passing server's tray, my hand steadier than I expected given the adrenaline now coursing through my system. The initial shock was rapidly crystallizing into something colder and more calculated. Rebecca had made a critical error in her theft, one that revealed both her desperation and her arrogance. She assumed that stealing my files gave her complete ownership of my work, but she hadn't counted on my foresight. The ambient conversation faded into white noise as I recalled the security measures I'd implemented months ago after the suspicious corruption of my lab's backup server. At the time, it had seemed paranoid to embed a subtle digital watermark, in all my research files. A unique cryptographic signature visible only when specific slides were viewed in sequence while running a verification algorithm. The pattern would be meaningless to anyone who didn't know to look for it, but under proper scrutiny, it would reveal not only the original creation date of each file, but also my digital signature and proprietary research identification codes. The weight of my phone in my pocket suddenly felt reassuring rather than burdensome. One text message to Professor Hiroshi Yamamoto, who had helped me develop the watermarking protocol, would set in motion the verification process. As head of the conference's ethics committee, his presence in the front row during Rebecca's keynote would ensure the perfect moment for exposure. The symmetry felt appropriate. Her public theft would lead to her public downfall. I wove through the crowd with deliberate calm, nodding to colleagues while maintaining the composed exterior expected of a researcher of my standing. Inside, my mind was compartmentalizing the steps needed to expose Rebecca's fraud without casting doubt on the research itself. The work was too important to patients waiting for breakthrough treatments to allow it to be tainted by academic scandal. The key. Terrace doors offered a momentary escape from the oppressive atmosphere inside. The evening air carried the subtle fragrance of the hotel's meticulously maintained garden, a welcome contrast to the mixture of expensive perfumes and academic tension within. I withdrew my phone and composed a carefully worded message to Professor Yamamoto, knowing his methodical nature would demand precision. Protocol Firebird requires activation during tonight's keynote. The Falcon has taken the nest. Verification sequence Alpha 7 Delta 9. Our predetermined code would alert him without causing premature concern. Within moments, his reply confirmed receipt. Understood. Verification equipment ready. Position secured. Slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling the first tendrils of vindication beginning to unfurl. Rebecca had underestimated me, assuming that my quiet demeanor indicated passivity or weakness. Like many before her, she had mistaken my thorough preparation for hesitation, my careful documentation for indecision. She would soon learn that methodical researchers make the most dangerous opponents. We leave nothing to chance. The conference organizer appeared at the terrace doorway, her expression professionally pleasant. Dr. Morgan, we've reserved your seat for the keynote. It begins in 15 minutes. I nodded my appreciation, allowing a small smile that she would interpret as anticipation for a colleague's presentation. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The large auditorium was filling rapidly as I took my assigned seat in the third row, perfectly positioned to observe both Rebecca on stage and Professor Yamamoto's reaction when the verification protocol revealed its results. The murmur of excited conversation rippled through the audience. Neural pathway regeneration represented one of the most promising frontiers in neuroscience, and Rebecca had cultivated a reputation for dramatic research presentations that captured media attention. The lights dimmed precisely on schedule, the audience settling into expectant silence as the conference director approached the podium. His introduction was appropriately glowing, detailing Rebecca's previous publications and awards without any awareness of the academic theft he was unwittingly endorsing. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rebecca Lawrence, whose groundbreaking research in neural pathway regeneration promises to revolutionize treatment options for patients with spinal cord injuries. The audience applause echoed my steadily beating heart, rhythmic, anticipatory, unaware of the dramatic shift about to occur. Rebecca took the stage with practiced confidence, her crimson blazer standing out against the blue backdrop like a warning flag. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. Her choice to wear the color associated with academic regalia for doctoral achievements on the night she planned to steal my research revealed both her ambition and her blindness to consequence. Distinguished colleagues, honored guests, she began, her voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and accessibility that had contributed to her meteoric rise in our field. Tonight, I present a new paradigm in neural regeneration therapy that challenges our fundamental understanding of spinal injury recovery. Her opening slide appeared on the massive screen behind her. My opening slide, with subtle aesthetic changes that did nothing to disguise the core content. I observed Professor Yamamoto in the front row, his tablet discreetly positioned to run the verification algorithm as the presentation progressed. His expression remained professionally impassive, but the slight tilt of his head indicated the program was already detecting the embedded watermarks. Each slide transition felt like the mechanical movement of a well-designed trap closing around its unsuspecting target. Rebecca presented my research with the confidence of someone who believed they would never be challenged, explaining methodologies she had never implemented and results she had never personally achieved. The perfection of her presentation made the theft all the more brazen. She hadn't simply stolen my conclusions, but had memorized every nuance of the work as if it were her own. 7 minutes into the presentation, I noticed Professor Yamamoto straighten almost imperceptibly in his seat. The verification was complete. A moment later, my phone vibrated with a single message: confirmed. 100% match to your original files. Timestamps authenticated. The room continued to watch in appreciative silence, unaware of the academic execution about to take place. Rebecca had reached the section on experimental results, her voice rising with practiced enthusiasm as she described breakthroughs she had never experienced. The data visualizations, my visualizations, filled the screen, compelling evidence of a scientific advance that could change countless lives. As you can see, she continued, gesturing to the neural imaging on display. The regenerative response following the novel application of the compound shows unprecedented activation patterns in previously dormant neural pathways. Professor Yamamoto rose from his seat with deliberate calm, the motion so smooth it seemed almost choreographed. Rebecca faltered mid-sentence, her presentation rhythm disrupted by the unexpected movement. Dr. Lawrence, Professor Yamamoto's voice carried the weight of his 30 years on ethics committees. I believe there's something unusual about your presentation that requires immediate clarification. The trap was sprung, the game was in motion, and Rebecca Lawrence was about to learn that in the world of research, meticulous documentation always reveals the truth, especially when that documentation contains hidden watermarks designed specifically to expose fraud. My journey to that pivotal moment hadn't been a straight path. 20 years earlier, I'd arrived at Westlake University with nothing but a scholarship, 2 suitcases, and an unwavering determination to make my mark in the scientific community. The research labs became my sanctuary, the place where my modest background ceased to matter in the face of methodical experimentation and data-driven results. While other students retreated to their dorms after classes, I remained hunched over microscopes until security guards gently reminded me of the building's closing hours. Professor Eleanor Jenkins took notice during my second year, inviting me to join her prestigious neuroscience research team despite my junior status. Raw talent needs proper cultivation, she told me, her eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses that had witnessed 3 decades of scientific breakthroughs. Under her mentorship, I learned that true scientific advancement wasn't about seeking glory, but about asking the right questions and pursuing answers with relentless precision. The Neural Regeneration Project began as a peripheral inquiry, a question raised during a late-night discussion about why certain neural pathways remained dormant after injury, while others established new connections. What started as theoretical exploration evolved into my life's work, consuming thousands of hours across 3 laboratories and 2 continents. Each incremental discovery built upon the last, creating a foundation of knowledge that eventually led to the breakthrough methodology now being presented as Rebecca Lawrence's work. My colleagues often commented on my meticulous documentation habits. "You record everything as if future scientists might audit your coffee breaks," Dr. Patel once joked during our collaboration at the Munich Institute. What appeared to be excessive caution was actually a lesson learned from Eleanor, who had once lost 6 months of research to a rival team due to inadequate protocol records. "In science," she would say, Your methodology is as important as your results. Both must be unimpeachable. This philosophy guided my approach to the neural pathway stimulation technique that had shown such promising results in preliminary trials. Each experiment was documented with exhaustive detail: equipment calibrations, environmental conditions, statistical analyses, even the batch numbers of every compound used. My research notebooks contained not just successful trials, but also every failure, each dead end meticulously recorded to prevent others from traveling down those same unproductive paths. The spinal injury patients who volunteered for early testing phases provided the human motivation behind my scientific persistence. Maria, a former gymnast paralyzed after a training accident, had been the first to show measurable response to the treatment. The day she reported feeling a tingling sensation in her previously non-responsive left foot became the emotional cornerstone of my commitment. "Even if it never gets better than this," she had said, tears tracking silently down her face. "Just knowing my body hasn't forgotten how to feel is worth everything." For patients like Maria, the research couldn't move quickly enough. Each procedural delay, each required approval from the ethics committee, each carefully controlled progression, from one experimental phase to the next, represented not just scientific thoroughness, but postponed hope for those waiting for treatment. This awareness created a constant tension between maintaining proper scientific rigor and accelerating the research timeline, a tension I navigated by working longer hours rather than cutting corners. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, in a laboratory illuminated only by computer screens and emergency exit signs. The neural pathway stimulation protocol, modified after 17 previous iterations, showed unprecedented activation patterns across the damaged spinal tissue samples. I remember standing perfectly still, afraid that even breathing might somehow alter the miraculous data appearing on my monitors. When repetition confirmed the results weren't anomalous, I permitted myself exactly 3 minutes of celebration. A silent, joyful dance around the empty lab, before beginning the exhaustive process of documentation that would transform an exciting outcome into verifiable science. The subsequent months dissolved into a blur of verification procedures, peer consultations, and preparation for the International Neuroscience Summit. Each day brought the research closer to formal presentation, while simultaneously increasing the pressure to ensure every aspect was bulletproof against scientific scrutiny. The methodology had to be replicable, the statistical analysis beyond reproach, the implications clearly delineated without overpromising results. Science advances through measured claims, not grandiose declarations. 2 weeks before the conference, I noticed the first irregularity in the laboratory access logs. Someone had entered the secure research database at 3:12 a.m. using my credentials, though I had been asleep in my apartment across town. The university's IT department suggested a system glitch. Automated backups sometimes registered as user access. Something about their explanation felt insufficient, but with the conference approaching and final presentation preparations demanding attention, I filed away the concern while implementing additional security protocols as a precaution. The second warning sign came when Dr. Lawrence suddenly changed her conference registration from a poster presentation to attendance-only status. Rebecca and I had maintained a cordial professional relationship despite competing for similar research grants over the years. Her specialty in neural inflammation shared methodological overlap with my regeneration work, though our research questions diverged significantly. Her withdrawal from presenting seemed curious but not alarming, until I learned she had requested last-minute access to the conference presentation schedule. Looking back, I should have connected these dots sooner, but hindsight always offers perfect clarity. In the moment, these incidents seemed like unrelated anomalies in the otherwise orderly progression toward my research presentation. The exhaustion of final preparation and the natural anxiety preceding a career-defining moment had narrowed my focus to the presentation itself, rather than the peripheral activities around it. What Rebecca failed to understand about me, what many colleagues misinterpreted, was that my quiet demeanor masked not insecurity but intense observation. Years of laboratory work had trained me to notice patterns others overlooked, to identify anomalies in seemingly normal processes. The same methodical approach that made me effective as a researcher had shaped my understanding of human behavior. I watched, I documented, and most importantly, I prepared for contingencies. My contingency planning extended beyond the laboratory. Each research computer contained not just primary data, but also embedded verification protocols. Every critical research file included digital timestamps and encrypted identification markers. External backup systems maintained verification logs that could authenticate original creation dates and authorized modification history. These weren't paranoid precautions, but standard procedures I'd implemented after witnessing a colleague lose years of work to data corruption without adequate backup systems. The watermarking protocol developed with Professor Yamamoto had been implemented 6 months earlier, after 3 research teams at different universities reported suspicious data breaches. The system was elegant in its simplicity, invisible to anyone viewing or even copying the files normally, but immediately apparent when analyzed with the appropriate verification algorithm. Each slide contained a portion of a complete digital signature that only became visible when the entire presentation was analyzed as a unified whole. This foresight wasn't born from an expectation of academic theft, but from the same careful preparation that characterized my approach to research. Control the variables you can, Eleanor had taught me, because experiment and life will provide enough uncontrolled ones without your help. The digital watermarking represented one more controlled variable in the complex experiment of academic publishing. The morning of Rebecca's keynote, originally scheduled as the day before my presentation, I had reviewed my own presentation one final time, ensuring every slide communicated precisely what was intended, no more and no less. The neural pathway regeneration research represented not just my work, but the potential future for patients like Maria, who deserved treatments based on methodical science rather than rushed conclusions. The integrity of the research transcended my personal credit or academic advancement. This perspective provided unexpected clarity when confronted with Rebecca's theft. While the immediate emotion was understandably one of betrayal and anger, these feelings quickly gave way to something more fundamental, a commitment to scientific truth. The research itself mattered more than who presented it. The patients waiting for treatment deserved better than to have promising methodology delayed or discredited by academic scandal. The scientific community needed accurate attribution not for ego gratification, but to ensure proper evaluation of research lineage and methodological development. As I watched Rebecca confidently stride across the stage, presenting my work as her own, I felt a curious sense of detachment from the personal affront. This wasn't merely about my stolen research. It was about maintaining the integrity of scientific communication that made collaborative progress possible. Without accurate attribution and honest presentation, the entire enterprise of shared scientific advancement would collapse into territorial disputes and duplicated efforts. The verification protocol with Professor Yamamoto wasn't designed for dramatic exposure, but for quiet confirmation that would allow the conference ethics committee to address the situation with minimal disruption to the scientific proceedings. Academic justice didn't require public humiliation. It required correction of the record and appropriate consequences applied through established channels. The research itself, and the patients waiting for its benefits, deserved this measured approach. Yet as Professor Yamamoto rose from his seat to interrupt Rebecca's presentation, I realized that some fraud was too blatant, too damaging to address, behind closed doors. Sometimes the protection of scientific integrity required public demonstration of the consequences for violating its fundamental principles. Rebecca had chosen the public stage for her theft. Now that same stage would become the venue for her exposure. Before we continue with this story of scientific deception and justice, I want to take a moment to connect with you, my wonderful audience. This channel has grown beyond anything I could have imagined when I started sharing these true stories of remarkable vindication and justice. Each week, thousands of you from across the globe join me to witness these powerful moments when the tables turn against those who thought they could take advantage of others without consequence. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm always amazed by how these stories resonate with people from Tokyo to Toronto, from Sydney to São Paulo. Last week's story about the corporate whistleblower brought comments from 73 different countries. It reminds me that regardless of our cultural differences, the human desire for justice and accountability transcends borders and languages. If you're new here, welcome to Turning Tables, where we explore real-life stories of people who found creative, intelligent ways to expose wrongdoing and hold the perpetrators accountable. I've spent the past 3 years collecting these accounts, interviewing the people involved, and crafting them into narratives that not only entertain, but also inspire. My background in investigative journalism gives me access to stories that would otherwise remain hidden. Tales of ordinary people facing extraordinary betrayals who found the courage and cleverness to fight back. Many viewers have messaged me asking how I find these remarkable stories. Some come through legal professionals who witnessed particularly satisfying cases of justice served. Others reach out directly after watching the channel, eager to share how they turned the tables on someone who wronged them. Each story goes through extensive verification. I review evidence, speak with multiple parties involved, and ensure the accounts are both accurate and ethically presented. While I occasionally change names to protect privacy, the core events remain unaltered. If this is your first time watching, you picked an excellent episode to start with. This story of academic theft and its exposure represents one of the most meticulously planned responses to betrayal I've ever encountered. As we continue, you'll witness how years of careful documentation and foresight created the perfect trap for someone who thought their academic status would shield them from consequences. For my regular viewers, you know I always save something special for the loyal members of this community. Tomorrow's bonus episode reveals what happened after the conference when the Academic Review Board convened to determine Dr. Lawrence's professional fate. The behind-closed-doors testimony includes revelations that couldn't be shared publicly until now. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications enabled, so you don't miss this exclusive follow-up that answers the questions you'll definitely have after today's conclusion. Scientific misconduct might seem like a niche topic, but the emotions at play, betrayal, indignation, vindication, resonate universally. Who among us hasn't experienced that sinking feeling when someone takes credit for our work? Perhaps it was a colleague presenting your idea as their own during a meeting, a classmate copying your assignment, or a friend claiming your clever observation in social settings. These small betrayals connect us to today's more dramatic story, reminding us why proper attribution matters in every context. The statistics on academic fraud might surprise you. A recent survey of research institutions found that nearly 34% of scientists and researchers have witnessed colleagues engaging in questionable research practices, including data manipulation, selective reporting, and yes, outright plagiarism. Yet only a fraction of these incidents result in formal investigations or consequences. Today's story represents the exception rather than the rule, a case where meticulous preparation created irrefutable evidence that couldn't be explained away or buried by institutional politics. Many of you have shared your own experiences with intellectual theft in the comments of previous videos. Lauren from Michigan described how her business proposal was stolen by her manager, who then received a promotion based on his innovative ideas. Carlos from Spain recounted discovering his photography on a company's website without attribution or compensation. These experiences create a particular type of violation, not just the theft of work, but the erasure of the creative spirit and effort behind it. What makes today's story particularly satisfying is the protagonist's foresight. Rather than merely reacting to the theft after it occurred, Their precautionary measures created a situation where the truth couldn't remain hidden. There's a powerful lesson here about documenting your work, establishing clear ownership, and creating systems that protect your intellectual property before problems arise. Several viewers have written to me saying these stories have inspired them to implement better documentation practices in their own professional lives. For those interested in the technical aspects of this case, I've prepared a detailed guide on digital watermarking techniques that professionals can use to protect their work. It's available through the link in the description below. While most of us won't need such sophisticated measures, the principle applies universally. Proper documentation serves as insurance against future disputes over ownership and attribution. If you're enjoying this narrative style, you might want to check out the playlist, Academic Accountability, where I've collected similar stories of scholarly justice. The case of the dissertation defense disaster remains one of the most watched videos on this channel, with over 3 million views, and counting. The pattern recognition between these cases reveals how institutional power can both enable misconduct and, when properly leveraged, help establish accountability. Many of you have been asking about the book I've been working on, Justice by Design: Strategic Responses to Modern Betrayals. I'm excited to share that it's now available for pre-order, with signed copies available for channel members. The book expands on many of the stories I've covered here while providing a framework for understanding these situations and constructing appropriate responses. It's written for anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of deception and wondered how to reclaim their narrative. The engagement on last week's story about workplace sabotage broke all previous records for the channel. Over 12,000 comments and counting. Your insights about corporate culture and the importance of maintaining receipts, both literal and figurative, added dimensions to the story I hadn't even considered. This community's collective wisdom continues to impress me, which is why I recently launched the membership program where viewers can participate in monthly case discussions and suggest stories for future episodes. As we approach the midpoint of today's story, I want to acknowledge the emotional impact these narratives can have. While there's undeniable satisfaction in seeing justice served, many of these situations emerge from painful betrayals that leave lasting wounds. Several mental health professionals in our viewer community have highlighted how these stories can be therapeutic for those who have experienced similar violations without resolution. Witnessing justice, even vicariously, can provide emotional closure when our own experiences left us without it. The protagonist in today's story represents a particular type of resilience, not the loud, dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the quiet, methodical persistence that creates foundations too solid to undermine. In preparing this episode, I spoke with several academic researchers who described how this case changed protocols at their institutions, creating more robust attribution mechanisms and clearer consequences for intellectual theft. One ripple of justice often creates waves that protect countless others. Speaking of protection, today's sponsor has been a tremendous supporter of this channel's mission. Sentinel Documentation Services provides cloud-based solutions for creative professionals who want to establish clear ownership of their work. Their timestamp certification is court-admissible and has helped numerous clients prove the provenance of their intellectual property in disputes. Use code Turning Tables for a 3-month free trial of their premium service. I only partner with companies whose values align with the channel's mission of accountability and protection. For educators watching, I've prepared classroom materials related to this episode, focusing on research ethics and professional integrity. These resources are available free of charge through the educational portal on our website. Several universities now use these case studies in their research methodology courses, helping future scientists understand not just the technical aspects of their fields, but the ethical frameworks that maintain scientific integrity across generations. The Revo community forums on our website have become a valuable resource for those navigating similar situations. The Documentation Strategies thread contains advice from legal professionals, technical experts, and people who have successfully protected their work in various fields. Remember that while these stories often culminate in dramatic moments of exposure, the real power lies in the methodical preparation that makes such moments possible. I notice we're approaching the 50-minute mark on this episode, which means we're about to dive into the confrontation portion of today's story. If you need to take a break, now is a perfect moment, but make sure you come back. The next segment contains the precise moment when Dr. Lawrence realizes her deception has been discovered, and it's too compelling to miss. The conference room's reaction alone makes this one of the most satisfying conclusions we've featured this season. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. Your comments, shares, and personal stories have created a community around this channel that goes beyond typical creator-viewer relationships. We're united by a shared appreciation for justice, particularly the kind that emerges not from institutional enforcement but from individual foresight and courage. Now, let's return to the International Neuroscience Summit, where Professor Yamamoto has just risen from his seat, about to change the trajectory of 2 scientific careers forever. The first indication that something was amiss came 3 weeks before the conference. I had been working late in the laboratory, finalizing the data analysis for my presentation, when Dr. Marcus Winters, head of our department, stopped by my workstation. His presence at this hour was unusual. Marcus typically departed promptly at 5, his administrative duties rarely extending into evening hours. The fluorescent lights accentuated the concerned creases around his eyes as he leaned against my desk, attempting casual conversation that felt anything but. Making progress on the Anderson account? I hear the client is expecting preliminary results this week, he asked, using our department's code name for confidential projects. The security protocol had been implemented after a competing firm had somehow acquired details of our bid for the Westlake development contract last year. I nodded, gesturing toward my organized spreadsheets. Final analysis phase. The client presentation is scheduled for next Thursday, provided legal gives final clearance on the patent application. I noticed Marcus glance at my computer screen with unusual intensity, his eyes lingering on the custom algorithm I'd developed for predictive market analysis. Excellent. The clients are flying in from Singapore. They've expressed particular interest in your methodology. He straightened his already impeccable tie, a nervous habit I'd observed during tense board meetings. Jefferson wants you to forward the complete file package to his assistant for review before Thursday's meeting. Jefferson Blake, our firm's senior partner, rarely involved himself in projects until the client presentation stage. His sudden interest in reviewing my work set off a quiet alarm in my mind. Of course, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Though the analysis contains several proprietary models I've developed, I'd prefer to walk him through those personally, to ensure nothing gets misinterpreted. Something flickered across Marcus's face. Discomfort, perhaps frustration, before his professional mask returned. Just send everything. Jefferson doesn't have time for a pre-brief. His tone carried an unusual edge. And make sure to include the predictive volatility model. That's the component he's most interested in. The volatility model, my prized innovation, the algorithm that had taken 18 months to perfect and that differentiated our market analysis from every competitor in the industry. The model that Jefferson had initially dismissed as theoretical over-engineering until preliminary testing showed its remarkable accuracy in predicting market fluctuations during periods of economic instability. I'll prepare a summary document explaining the model's key parameters, I offered, watching Marcus's reaction carefully. The raw code requires context to be properly understood. Just the complete files, Marcus insisted, his artificial smile stiffening. Unfiltered and functional. Jefferson needs to see the actual working model, not a description. He glanced at his watch, suddenly eager to conclude our conversation. Have everything in his inbox by morning. After Marcus departed, I sat motionless. In the empty office, the hum of the air conditioning system the only sound accompanying my racing thoughts. Jefferson Blake had built our firm's reputation on aggressive expansion, acquiring smaller analytics companies and absorbing their proprietary methods into our service portfolio. His business acumen was undeniable, but rumors persisted about projects mysteriously aligned with proprietary methods from acquired competitors, methods that sometimes emerged shortly before those competitors accepted Blake Consulting's acquisition offers at surprisingly favorable terms. I stayed 3 hours past midnight, creating what appeared to be complete project files while implementing subtle modifications to the volatility model. The changes wouldn't be apparent in basic testing, but would cause the algorithm to flag its outputs as simulations rather than authorized analyses if anyone attempted to use it without proper authentication protocols. It wasn't paranoia if the precaution was warranted. The morning of the client presentation arrived with unexpected developments. My calendar notification indicated a last-minute room change and an earlier start time, 8:30 instead of the originally scheduled 10 GAGV. More unusual still was the email notification that Jefferson would be presenting personally, with my role shifted to technical support. The explanation cited the client's compressed schedule and Jefferson's existing relationship with their CFO, both plausible reasons that nonetheless felt constructed. I arrived at 8 hours, purposely early, to find the conference room already occupied. Through the partially open door, I could see Jefferson standing at the presentation podium, advancing through slides that looked remarkably familiar. My slides, in fact, with only the header template and color scheme modified. On the large display screen, my volatility model diagram appeared, stripped of my identifying notations but otherwise intact. The culmination of 18 months of development displayed as if it had emerged fully formed from Jefferson's considerable but entirely different expertise. The proprietary predictive volatility algorithm represents a significant advance in market forecasting, Jefferson was explaining to Marcus and Diane from Legal Affairs. We'll position it as a Blake Consulting exclusive methodology, pending patent approval. Diane frowned, tapping her tablet screen. The patent application will require detailed attribution of development. Have we documented the research progression adequately? Jefferson's smile remained diplomatic, but his tone carried unmistakable finality. The development occurred under Blake Consulting's umbrella using company resources. The attribution will reflect institutional development rather than individual contribution. And Thompson? Diane asked, referring to me by last name in the firm's typical fashion. I understood this was primarily their project, Marcus interjected, his voice carrying the forced confidence I'd heard during difficult client objections. Thompson compiled the data points, but the conceptual breakthrough and algorithmic structure came from Jefferson's strategic direction. The documentation will reflect that appropriately. The blood in my veins seemed to chill by several degrees as the implications became clear. They weren't just presenting my work without attribution. They were actively planning to claim it entirely, erasing 18 months of my innovation from the record completely. The patent would list Jefferson as the primary inventor, with perhaps a minor acknowledgement of my contribution as a data analyst rather than the architect of the entire system. I stepped back from the door, mind racing. The presentation to the Singapore clients would begin in 20 minutes. In that time, Jefferson would present my volatility model as his own creation, establishing public claim to the innovation before I could object. Once those clients implemented the model and signed the exclusivity agreement, challenging the attribution would become nearly impossible without damaging the firm's reputation and potentially violating client confidentiality. The methodical theft had been executed perfectly. Jefferson had waited until the model proved its value, then positioned himself to claim ownership just as it became marketable. Marcus had facilitated the process, likely in exchange for partnership consideration that had eluded him for the past 3 years. Even Legal Affairs had been incorporated into the strategy, focused on protecting the firm's intellectual property without examining too closely where that property had originated. I retreated to my office, outwardly calm while inwardly recalibrating. My understanding of the past 3 years at Blake Consulting. Small moments suddenly acquired new significance. Jefferson's unusual interest in my research resources, Marcus's insistence on receiving progress updates that included methodology details, the firm's emphasis on documenting everything in the shared project drives rather than personal development spaces. The architecture of theft had been established long before the final act. The betrayal stung not just because of the intellectual property implications, but because I had genuinely believed in the firm's meritocratic claims. Jefferson had personally recruited me from my previous position, emphasizing how Blake Consulting rewarded innovation regardless of seniority. "Great ideas win here," he had assured me during the interview process. "We don't care if the breakthrough comes from a first-year analyst or a senior partner." That apparent commitment to intellectual honesty had been the deciding factor in accepting their offer over competing firms. My computer chimed with a calendar reminder for the client presentation. 15 minutes until my work would be presented. As someone else's, my professional legacy quietly erased while I was expected to smile and provide technical support for my own innovation. The familiar sensation of adrenaline cleared my thoughts, focusing them toward strategic response rather than emotional reaction. The volatility model existed in 3 versions. The first resided on Blake Consulting's secure servers, uploaded, as required by contract, but subtly modified to include the authentication protocols I'd implemented during those late-night hours. The second version existed in my personal development environment, an external secure server I maintained for preliminary work before transferring finalized components to company systems. The third and most critical version had been documented through blockchain verification timestamps, each development milestone cryptographically recorded with immutable proof of creation date, time, and authorship. This third version had seemed like unnecessary paranoia when I implemented it, a decision influenced by a cybersecurity conference where a speaker had emphasized the vulnerability of intellectual property in corporate environments. "Your greatest threat isn't external hackers, but internal systems that enable plausible attribution shifting," the speaker had warned. Blockchain verification creates immutable evidence of creative provenance that even the most sophisticated internal theft can't overcome. The conference room doors would open in 12 minutes. The Singapore clients, representing potential annual revenue exceeding 8 figures, would be ushered into an environment designed to impress. Blake Consulting's finest conference room, with its panoramic city views, refreshments selected based on cultural research, and presentation materials that perfectly balance technical detail with strategic overview. Jefferson would stand at the podium, radiating the confident expertise that had built the firm's reputation, presenting my volatility model as the crown jewel of his analytical innovation. In that moment of crystalline clarity, I understood that 3 paths lay before me. I could remain silent, accepting the theft while continuing to develop new methods that would likely be appropriated in similar fashion. I could confront Jefferson directly, triggering an internal conflict that would damage my career prospects regardless of outcome. Or I could implement the contingency protocol I had established precisely for this scenario, a response that would require perfect timing and irrefutable evidence. The third path carried significant professional risk, but provided the only route to both protect my intellectual property and expose the systematic theft without destroying my own reputation in the process. The blockchain verification records couldn't be altered, even by Blake Consulting's considerable technical resources. The authentication protocols embedded in the official version would activate the moment Jefferson attempted to demonstrate the model's functionality, creating a documented trail of unauthorized usage. I gathered my materials and headed toward the conference room, outwardly composed while mentally reviewing each step of the contingency protocol. Timing would prove essential. The evidence needed to emerge after Jefferson established his claim, but before the clients committed to implementation. The confrontation would occur in the most public setting possible, with witnesses whose professional reputations would require them to acknowledge the evidence once presented. As I approached the conference room, Jefferson emerged from the private preparation area, adjusting his bespoke suit jacket and reviewing note cards. His confident smile barely acknowledged my presence, the momentary glance of a senior partner noting a technical resource rather than a colleague. In that brief eye contact, I saw no guilt, no recognition of the ethical breach about to occur, only the practiced confidence of someone who believed power conferred ownership. That absence of moral hesitation provided the final confirmation I needed. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an attribution oversight, but a deliberate, calculated theft by someone who had done this before and would continue unless confronted with incontrovertible evidence. The volatility model represented years of my professional innovation, but its significance extended beyond personal credit. It embodied the principle that intellectual creation deserves honest attribution, regardless of corporate hierarchy. I entered the conference room exactly 9 minutes before the scheduled presentation, taking my assigned seat near the technical support station. The modified presentation gleamed on the main screen, my work rebranded under Jefferson's name, ready to impress clients who would never know its true origin unless I activated the contingency protocol. The moment of decision had arrived, and, with it, the responsibility to protect not just my own work, but the integrity of attribution that formed the foundation of intellectual innovation itself. Jefferson Blake commanded the conference room with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades convincing people to trust him with their money. His tailored Italian suit, Patek Philippe watch, and perfectly modulated voice all conveyed a singular message. Success follows those who follow Jefferson Blake. The Singapore clients, 3 executives from Meridian Holdings who controlled a 9-figure investment portfolio, leaned forward slightly as he began his presentation, already half convinced by his reputation alone. Gentlemen, what you're about to see represents a fundamental shift in predictive market analytics, Jefferson announced, clicking to the first substantive slide, my slide, with only the header modified. Blake Consulting has developed a proprietary algorithm that accurately predicted market fluctuations during the past 3 economic downturns with 87% accuracy. His emphasis on Blake Consulting was subtle but unmistakable, corporate attribution rather than individual recognition. From my position at the technical support station, I observed the careful choreography of his presentation. Jefferson maintained steady eye contact with each client in rotation, his gestures precise and confident. His technical explanations simplified just enough to impress without overwhelming. He had mastered the art of appearing to reveal proprietary insights, while actually disclosing only the most superficial aspects of the methodology. The predictive volatility model operates on 3 core principles, he continued, advancing to the mathematical framework I had developed during months of late nights and discarded approaches. First, it identifies counter-cyclical indicators that traditional models overlook. Second, it incorporates sentiment analysis from non-traditional data sources to anticipate market psychology. Finally, it applies a proprietary weighting system that adjusts dynamically as conditions evolve. Mr. Liang, Meridian's chief investment officer, nodded appreciatively. Impressive framework. What differentiates this from quantum-based predictive models currently entering the market? Jefferson smiled, prepared for this question because I had included it in my briefing document as a likely client concern. An excellent question that speaks to your technical understanding, Mr. Liang. While quantum approaches offer theoretical advantages in processing power, our volatility model addresses the fundamental limitation of all current predictive systems: identification of which variables actually matter during transition periods. The clients exchanged glances. Jefferson had navigated the technical challenge perfectly, acknowledging their sophistication while positioning our solution as superior. I noticed Marcus Winters in the corner, smiling approvingly at this performance. His position as department head had been secured through similar presentations of others' work, a practice apparently sanctioned at the highest levels of Blake Consulting. If I may, Jefferson continued, approaching what I recognized as the critical juncture in the presentation, I'd like to demonstrate the model's functionality using real-time market data. He gestured toward the auxiliary screen where the volatility model interface waited. This represents the culmination of my work in predictive analytics, a system that identifies market inflection points before conventional indicators detect the shift. My work. Not our work, not the team's work, but specifically his work. The attribution claim was now explicit, spoken directly to external clients who would carry this understanding into implementation discussions. Jefferson's confidence appeared. Absolute, his ownership of the intellectual property stated as simple fact, rather than the fabrication it actually was. With deliberate motions, Jefferson entered his credentials into the model interface. The system requires authentication to prevent unauthorized access to the proprietary algorithms, he explained, positioning this security measure as protection for clients rather than what it actually was. The trigger for my embedded verification. Protocols. The authentication screen accepted his credentials as designed, displaying the model's primary dashboard. Jefferson began explaining the visualization components, each graph and data field representing portions of my analytical framework, repackaged under Blake Consulting's interface design. His technical explanation was surprisingly accurate. He had clearly studied the methodology documentation thoroughly to prepare for potential client questions. The model draws from 17 distinct data streams, Jefferson explained, highlighting various components with a laser pointer. These include standard market indicators, but also alternative data sources such as supply chain disruption patterns, regulatory language sentiment analysis, and social media response clustering around economic terms. Mr. Chen, Meridian's Risk Management Director, leaned forward. Impressive scope. How do you validate the predictive accuracy retrospectively? Another excellent question, Jefferson responded, clicking to the historical validation screen. The system can be back-tested against any time period with available data. For example, he selected the 2008 financial crisis from the drop-down menu, initiating the demonstration that would allow clients to visualize how the model would have predicted market movements during a known volatile period. This particular demonstration represented the most complex aspect of the volatility model, the component that had required months of refinement to achieve reliable results. It also contained the most sophisticated authentication protocol I had embedded, designed to activate only when someone other than me attempted to present it as original work. Jefferson continued confidently as the system processed the historical data. You'll see that unlike traditional models that identified warning signals only after critical thresholds were breached, our volatility predictions preceded market movement by an average of 17 trading days during this period. The screen displayed the initial loading graphics, progress bars filling as expected, until a small dialog box appeared in the corner of the interface. Simulation mode active, demonstration only, not authorized for client implementation. The text was small but clearly visible on the presentation screen. Jefferson paused momentarily, his rhythm interrupted, before smoothly continuing. As you can see, the system displays appropriate notices during demonstration mode. This ensures clients understand when they're viewing simulated results versus live implementation. His adaptation was impressive, reframing an unexpected security notification as an intentional client protection feature. He quickly minimized the dialog box and continued the demonstration, but the system had been activated. Each subsequent screen now displayed a small watermark in the corner. Prototype visualization, developer, A. Thompson, authentication required for implementation. The watermark was subtle enough that most viewers would miss it unless specifically looking for attribution markers. But its presence was unmistakable to anyone reviewing the materials closely. The proprietary algorithms identify correlation patterns that would be virtually impossible to recognize through conventional analysis, Jefferson continued, either not noticing the watermarks or choosing to ignore them. His confidence remained unshaken, his ownership claim implicit in every explanation of methodology and design choice. As the demonstration progressed to the algorithmic component selection screen, another security feature activated. The system briefly displayed a blockchain verification notification. Component architecture verified. Original timestamp 18 months prior. Blockchain ID AT7729VBM. The notification appeared for only 3 seconds before automatically closing, but its appearance was noted by Mr. Liang, whose background in financial technology made him particularly attentive to authentication protocols. "Interesting security feature," Mr. Liang commented, gesturing toward where the notification had appeared. "Is blockchain verification standard for all your proprietary systems?" Jefferson hesitated for just a fraction of a second, the first genuine disruption in his polished presentation. "Yes, we implement blockchain verification for all our proprietary methodologies. It creates an immutable record of development milestones." His explanation was technically accurate but strategically incomplete, avoiding any mention of why blockchain verification would include developer identification or timestamp information. "And the developer attribution markers?" Mr. Liang continued, his attention now focused on the subtle watermarks appearing throughout the interface. "Is that part of your internal quality control process?" The conference room's atmosphere shifted, subtly. Jefferson maintained his composed expression, but I noticed a slight tension in his posture. The first indication that he recognized something unexpected was occurring in his carefully orchestrated presentation. "We maintain comprehensive development documentation," Jefferson replied, his tone still confident though slightly more measured. "Blake Consulting believes in recognizing technical contributions while maintaining institutional ownership of all proprietary methods." The statement represented a masterful attempt to acknowledge the visible evidence while reinforcing corporate attribution over individual creation. Mr. Chen, less technically focused than his colleague, seemed satisfied with this explanation, but Mr. Liang's expression indicated lingering curiosity. Jefferson smoothly redirected the conversation toward implementation logistics, timeline, integration requirements, and support structures, moving away from the methodology itself toward the business relationship aspects where his authority was unquestioned. Throughout this transition, additional authentication markers continued appearing at strategic junctures in the presentation. None were obtrusive enough to disrupt the demonstration completely, but their cumulative presence created an unmistakable pattern of developer identification separate from Jefferson's presentation claims. "The implementation process typically takes 6 weeks, Jefferson explained, displaying the project timeline slide. "During this period, our technical team works directly with your analysts to customize parameters specific to your portfolio characteristics." As if on cue, Marcus gestured toward me. "Thompson here would serve as your technical implementation lead, handling the customization and integration phases." Jefferson nodded, maintaining his executive composure. "Indeed, Thompson has been instrumental in preparing the system for client deployment." This carefully worded acknowledgement represented the first time my contribution had been mentioned during the presentation, a minimal recognition prompted by Marcus rather than volunteered by Jefferson himself. The demonstration concluded with the expected impressed responses from the Singapore clients. They asked appropriate questions about implementation costs, ongoing support, and competitive differentiation, all of which Jefferson answered with practiced expertise. The presentation appeared successful by conventional metrics, yet the subtle authentication markers had created a documentation trail that contradicted the ownership narrative Jefferson had presented. As the formal presentation concluded and conversation shifted to more casual discussion over refreshments, I observed Jefferson in quiet conversation with Marcus, their expressions serious despite the presentation's apparent success. Jefferson glanced in my direction briefly, his expression unreadable, but his body language suggesting awareness that something unexpected had occurred. The Singapore clients congregated near the refreshment table, comparing notes and impressions. Mr. Liang occasionally glanced toward the demonstration screen where the model interface remained visible, complete with its subtle attribution markers. His analytical mind was clearly processing the discrepancy between Jefferson's ownership claims and the system's embedded identification markers. What Jefferson failed to understand, what his confidence had prevented him from considering, was that intellectual attribution leaves evidence trails that cannot be easily erased or explained away. The volatility model contained not just the visible security features that had appeared during the demonstration, but layers of authentication protocols that would become increasingly explicit if implementation proceeded under false attribution. TC. Next phase would activate during the technical specification review, where detailed documentation would be provided to the client's technical team. That documentation contained blockchain-verified development logs with immutable timestamps and author identifications, evidence that would make the true provenance of the volatility model undeniable to anyone with technical authority to implement. And Jefferson's confidence in presenting my work as his own stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of modern intellectual property protection. He believed that corporate hierarchy conferred ownership rights regardless of actual creation, that his position as senior partner gave him authority to reassign attribution at will. This belief reflected an outdated paradigm where power dictated reality, a paradigm increasingly undermined by distributed verification systems designed specifically to protect individual intellectual contributions within corporate environments. As I watched Jefferson maintain his composed exterior while attempting to process the unexpected authentication markers, I recognized the particular vulnerability of those who believe their authority makes them invulnerable. His confidence had prevented him from considering the possibility that I had protected my work with mechanisms beyond his control, that intellectual attribution could be embedded within the very system he was attempting to claim as his own. The demonstration had concluded successfully in conventional terms, yet seeds of doubt had been planted. Mr. Liang's technical background made him particularly receptive to these subtle indicators, his questions revealing an underlying curiosity about the development process that Jefferson's vague responses had not satisfied. The blockchain verification notifications, though brief, had created documentation viewable by clients who would soon be examining the system's technical specifications in detail. Jefferson Blake, master of corporate presentations and expert in client relations, maintained his confident demeanor as the meeting transitioned to informal discussion. Yet beneath that polished exterior, the first hairline fractures had appeared in his carefully constructed narrative, small but significant indicators that the intellectual theft he had attempted was not proceeding according to plan. What Jefferson couldn't have known, what no one at Blake Consulting had discovered, was that my preparation for this moment had begun 18 months earlier, when I first noticed subtle patterns suggesting systematic intellectual appropriation within the firm. The evidence had accumulated gradually. Junior analysts whose innovative approaches appeared in senior presentations without attribution, promising projects mysteriously reassigned when they demonstrated potential, and the curiously consistent pattern of Blake Consulting filing patents listing senior partners as primary inventors, regardless of who had developed the actual methodology. My suspicions crystallized during a company retreat in Aspen, 7 months before the Singapore client presentation. After the day's strategy sessions, several senior partners gathered in the lodge's private bar area, the combination of premium scotch and perceived privacy loosening their usual discretion. I had returned to retrieve my forgotten tablet and paused outside the partially open door when I heard Jefferson's distinctive laugh, followed by a comment that froze me in place. The Chen methodology was brilliant. Properly packaged, it's worth 8 figures in the Asian markets alone, Jefferson was saying, swirling his Macallan 25 with practiced nonchalance. Fortunately, Chen developed it under our roof, so it's ours to monetize however we see fit. Marcus Winter's response carried the eager agreement of someone speaking to a superior they wished to impress. The attribution adjustment was handled smoothly. Chen accepted the technical lead credit without question. He never realized the patent filing listed you as primary developer. "That's why we hire them young," Jefferson replied, his tone conspirationally lowered yet still audible from my position. "They're brilliant but naive, more interested in solving problems than understanding ownership frameworks. By the time they recognize the game, the documentation is established and legally binding." The conversation continued, detailing at least 3 other cases where significant methodologies had been essentially appropriated from their creators through careful manipulation of internal attribution and strategic control of client-facing documentation. That night in my hotel room, I began formulating what would eventually become my comprehensive protection strategy. The following morning, I contacted Elaine Winters at Quantum Seal, a blockchain verification service specifically designed for intellectual property protection. Unlike standard IP legal services, Quantum Seal created immutable timestamp verification of development milestones without requiring disclosure of the actual content, perfect for protecting proprietary methods while maintaining corporate confidentiality requirements. "What you're describing is unfortunately common in quantitative fields," Elaine had explained during our initial consultation. "The legal construct of work for hire gets weaponized to enable what amounts to intellectual gaslighting, convincing creators they don't actually own what they've created, or worse, that they didn't create it at all." Under her guidance, I established a comprehensive documentation system that operated parallel to Blake Consulting's internal repositories. My volatility model development proceeded on company systems as required by contract, but each significant milestone was simultaneously verified through Quantum Seal's blockchain protocol, creating a tamper-proof record of creation timing, methodology evolution, and authorship. The blockchain verification doesn't prevent them from claiming ownership under work-for-hire provisions, Elaine had cautioned, but it creates irrefutable evidence of who actually developed the methodology and when. That evidence becomes crucial if attribution disputes ever reach legal proceedings. This protection framework extended beyond simple documentation. Working nights and weekends, I developed an elaborate system of authentication protocols embedded within the volatility model itself. Digital watermarks and verification triggers that would remain dormant until specific conditions activated them. These weren't merely passive identifiers, but intelligent components programmed to respond differently depending on how and by whom the system was being used. When accessed under my credentials, the volatility model functioned normally, with attribution, markers visible only in the technical documentation layers where they belonged. When accessed by authorized team members for development purposes, the system displayed appropriate collaborative attribution notices acknowledging both individual contributions and corporate ownership. But when someone attempted to present the model as their original work to external parties, exactly the scenario unfolding in the Singapore client presentation, the embedded protocols activated sequentially, revealing attribution markers. With increasing visibility, the technical implementation had required careful consideration of Blake Consulting's cybersecurity measures. The company employed sophisticated protection against external threats, but paid minimal attention to internal authentication architecture, a common blind spot in corporate security frameworks. This oversight provided the perfect opportunity to implement nested verification protocols that would appear as standard security features while actually serving as attribution protection mechanisms. 3 months before the Singapore presentation, I had taken the additional precaution of securing technical documentation with a specialized legal service that provided sealed verification without requiring disclosure of confidential content. The service, commonly used by patent attorneys to establish development precedents without public filing, created legally admissible evidence of the volatility model's development history, methodology evolution, and clear attribution record. This multi-layered protection strategy wasn't developed out of paranoia, but from careful observation of established patterns at Blake Consulting. Jefferson's appropriation of others' work wasn't opportunistic, but systematic. a deliberately constructed process refined through multiple iterations. He selected promising methodologies, monitored their development until commercial viability was established, then strategically repositioned attribution through controlled client presentations and carefully managed documentation. What made my case different, what Jefferson couldn't have anticipated, was that I had documented his previous appropriations while implementing protection for my own work. During those months of preparation, I had discreetly interviewed junior analysts whose work had been absorbed into Blake Consulting's intellectual portfolio without proper attribution. None had confronted the issue directly, fearing career repercussions, but several had provided detailed accounts once assured of confidentiality. Jefferson presented my risk assessment framework as his own during the European expansion pitch, one analyst had confided. When I raised concerns with HR, they explained that all work product belongs to the firm, and attribution is determined by strategic needs rather than development history. 3 months later, I was transferred to the regional office in Detroit. Another analyst, now working for a competitor, had been more direct. Blake Consulting doesn't have an innovation problem. It has an attribution problem. Brilliant work happens there, but recognition flows upward while accountability flows downward. The volatility model you're developing will definitely attract attention from the partners. If it shows commercial potential, prepare for collaborative attribution adjustment. That's the internal euphemism for what happens next. These conversations reinforced the necessity of my precautions and provided additional evidence of the pattern I was documenting. Jefferson's approach wasn't merely unethical, but potentially actionable if sufficient evidence could establish a systematic practice rather than isolated incidents. The most critical component of my preparation had been the relationship developed with Samuel Chen at Meridian Holdings, the Singapore client whose team was now receiving Jefferson's presentation. Samuel and I had connected at an industry conference the previous year, finding common ground in our quantitative approaches to market analysis. Our subsequent professional correspondence had remained appropriately bounded by confidentiality requirements, but had established mutual respect that would prove invaluable. 2 weeks before the presentation, when I discovered my role had been reduced to technical support, while Jefferson positioned himself as the volatility model's creator, I had sent Samuel a carefully worded message. Looking forward to Meridian's visit. The presentation you'll see contains some innovative attribution approaches that merit close attention, particularly regarding development verification protocols. The message contained no confidentiality violations, no disclosure of proprietary methodology, or explicit warnings about misattribution. Yet it had primed Samuel to pay particular attention to the attribution indicators that would appear during Jefferson's demonstration. Mr. Liang's pointed questions about blockchain verification and developer attribution markers confirmed that this subtle preparation had achieved its intended effect. Beyond these technical and professional preparations, I had taken the precaution of consulting specialized legal counsel experienced in intellectual property disputes within consulting firms. Attorney Eliza Harrington had reviewed my employment contract, Blake Consulting's intellectual property policies, and the documentation of my volatility model development. Your situation represents a common tension in knowledge work, Eliza had explained. The firm undoubtedly owns the work product under your employment agreement, but attribution and credit represent a separate consideration. Your blockchain verification doesn't challenge their ownership rights, but creates an immutable record of authorship that becomes relevant if they attempt to claim not just ownership, but origination. This distinction between ownership and origination had shaped my entire strategy. Blake Consulting legitimately owned the volatility model under the terms of my employment, a fact I had never disputed. What they couldn't legitimately claim was that Jefferson had created it, a distinction with significant implications for both my professional reputation and the firm's client representations. The final component of my preparation had involved careful documentation of Jefferson's pattern of behavior through a secure chronology of appropriation incidents, witness statements from former employees, and archived presentation materials demonstrating the systematic nature of attribution, reassignment. This documentation didn't directly protect my volatility model, but established the context of deliberate misconduct rather than isolated misunderstanding. As the Singapore clients engaged in post-presentation discussion with Jefferson and Marcus, I maintained my position at the technical support station, outwardly focused on system maintenance while actually monitoring the progressive activation of authentication protocols. The initial markers had appeared exactly as designed during the demonstration. The secondary protocols would activate during the technical implementation phase, revealing more comprehensive attribution evidence as the client's technical team engaged with the system architecture. The preparation that had seemed possibly excessive 18 months earlier now appeared prescient. Jefferson's confident presentation of my work as his own creation followed exactly the pattern I had documented with previous appropriations. His dismissal of my contribution as merely technical support rather than system architect reflected the standard attribution adjustment applied to other innovative methodologies developed by junior analysts. What Jefferson couldn't know, what his confidence prevented him from even considering, was that the volatility model contained its own defense mechanisms, embedded at the architectural level and impossible to remove without rendering the system non-functional. Unlike previous analysts whose work had been appropriated, I had anticipated this moment and prepared comprehensive countermeasures designed not to prevent the appropriation attempt, but to document it irrefutably when it occurred. The Singapore clients ended their hushed discussion and returned their attention to Jefferson, who had masterfully maintained his poised demeanor despite the unexpected attribution markers that had appeared during his presentation. His confidence remained outwardly unshaken, secure in the institutional authority that had protected similar appropriations in the past. In his calculation, the momentary awkwardness of unexplained attribution notices was insignificant compared to the established power dynamics of Blake Consulting's client relationships. What would unfold next had been 18 months in preparation, a carefully orchestrated revelation that would force recognition of the volatility model's true development, history without undermining its commercial potential or Blake Consulting's client relationships. The attribution correction would occur not through confrontation, but through the progressive, inevitable disclosure of verification evidence too comprehensive to dismiss and too technically embedded to overcome. The technical implementation meeting, scheduled for tomorrow, would bring the client's quantitative specialists into direct engagement with the system architecture, where more explicit attribution evidence would become visible. The documentation package being prepared for their legal review contained blockchain verification records establishing clear development provenance. The system itself would continue revealing additional attribution markers as implementation proceeded, creating a consistent evidence trail visible to all parties involved in the project. Jefferson Blake had built his reputation on appropriating others' innovations through careful manipulation of corporate attribution mechanisms. His confidence in presenting my volatility model as his own creation stemmed from successful execution of this strategy multiple times before. What he couldn't have anticipated was that this particular appropriation attempt had been expected, documented, and countered through comprehensive preparation that began long before he identified the volatility model as his next acquisition target. The Singapore clients departed the conference room with handshakes and promises of follow-up discussions, their expressions revealing a mixture of enthusiasm for the volatility model's capabilities and lingering questions about its development. Jefferson maintained his professional demeanor until the elevator doors closed behind them, his practiced smile immediately dropping as he turned toward Marcus. "What the hell was that?" Jefferson's voice remained controlled but carried an unmistakable edge. "Developer attribution markers? Blockchain verification notices? Those weren't in the demonstration yesterday." Marcus glanced nervously in my direction as I methodically packed up the technical support equipment, apparently unsure whether to address me directly or maintain the pretense that I wasn't the center of their concern. "I'll have IT review the Presentation version. Must be some kind of system update that activated additional security protocols. Jefferson didn't appear convinced. Security protocols don't typically include developer names, particularly not during client presentations. He straightened his Italian silk tie, a habitual gesture when recalculating his approach. Thompson, a word before you leave. I nodded, completing the equipment shutdown with unhurried precision. Of course. The conference room emptied quickly, other team members sensing the tension and finding sudden reasons to be elsewhere. When only the three of us remained, Jefferson closed the door and positioned himself strategically at the head of the table, physically establishing the hierarchy he intended to enforce. Those authentication markers weren't in the approved presentation materials, he began, his tone suggesting this was a technical oversight rather than deliberate attribution protection. Explain what happened. I maintained neutral professionalism, neither confrontational nor apologetic. The volatility model contains standard authentication protocols that activate when accessed through certain credential pathways. They're designed to prevent unauthorized use while maintaining appropriate attribution records. Appropriate attribution? Jefferson's eyes narrowed slightly. The model was developed under Blake Consulting's auspices using firm resources. Proprietary methodologies are presented under corporate attribution, not individual. Corporate ownership and development attribution are separate considerations, I replied, using almost exactly the language Eliza Harrington had employed during our legal consultation. The authentication protocols don't challenge Blake Consulting's ownership rights, but maintain accurate development records for technical implementation purposes. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. These protocols should have been disclosed during the preparation phase. We can't have unexpected elements appearing during client presentations. The protocols were fully documented in the technical specifications submitted 3 months ago, I responded, retrieving my tablet and opening a file containing the relevant documentation. Section 7.3 details the authentication architecture, including attribution preservation mechanisms and blockchain verification integration. I placed the tablet on the conference table, screen facing them. This documentation was approved through the standard review process. Jefferson didn't look at the tablet, maintaining direct eye contact instead. Technical specifications are for implementation teams, not client presentations. The demonstration version should have been cleared of all development markers, removing. The authentication protocols would render the system vulnerable to unauthorized replication, I explained, the careful phrasing concealing a more fundamental truth, that the attribution markers were deliberately embedded at the architectural level specifically to prevent their removal. The protocols are integrated components of the system architecture, not optional interface elements. Jefferson's expression remained controlled, but his fingers tapped a subtle rhythm on the polished conference table, a tell I'd observed during tense negotiations when he was calculating risk factors before responding. Thompson, let's be direct. Your contribution to the volatility model has been significant and will be appropriately acknowledged in the technical implementation phase. However, client-facing presentations require unified corporate messaging that emphasizes institutional capabilities rather than individual contributions. The offered compromise revealed Jefferson's initial strategy: acknowledge my role in a limited context while maintaining his claim to conceptual origination. It represented the standard first step in Blake Consulting's attribution adjustment process, offering technical recognition while preserving the more valuable conceptual credit. I appreciate the acknowledgement, I replied, my tone remaining professional, rather than confrontational. However, the authentication protocols aren't about recognition, but about system integrity. They ensure that implementation proceeds according to validated development parameters and maintains consistency with the blockchain verification record. Marcus attempted to redirect the conversation toward practical next steps. We can address the attribution displays before tomorrow's technical session, IT should be able to modify the interface elements without compromising the underlying functionality. Unfortunately, that won't be possible, I responded with appropriate regret in my tone. The authentication protocols are integrated at the architectural level. Attempting to remove them would trigger system-wide validation failures. The blockchain verification specifically prevents unauthorized modification of attribution components, a security feature designed to protect both developer and corporate interests. Jefferson's expression shifted subtly as the implications became clearer. This wasn't a simple interface issue that could be resolved with cosmetic adjustments, but a fundamental architectural design that had anticipated and prevented attribution modification. His gaze sharpened, recognizing that the situation was more deliberate than it initially appeared. These extensive security measures seem excessive for an internal development project, he observed, his tone suggesting suspicion without making direct accusations. Almost as if they were designed specifically to prevent modification of attribution records. I met his gaze directly, neither confirming nor denying the implication. The volatility model represents significant intellectual investment. Comprehensive security measures protect that investment for all stakeholders, including Blake Consulting. Jefferson changed tactics, his voice assuming the mentoring tone he used when shaping junior analysts' understanding of firm culture. Thompson, you've shown remarkable technical capability. Your future at Blake Consulting is promising, with potential advancement that would benefit from a clear understanding of how attribution functions in corporate environments. Individual recognition occurs through career progression, not client-facing attribution. The implied offer was clear. Accept the attribution adjustment now in exchange for accelerated promotion later. It represented the carrot that typically accompanied the implicit stick in Blake Consulting's approach to intellectual appropriation. I appreciate the career guidance, I replied, maintaining professional composure. My primary concern remains ensuring the volatility model's successful implementation for Meridian Holdings. The authentication protocols are essential to that implementation, particularly when their technical team begins integration with their existing systems tomorrow. Marcus glanced anxiously between us, recognizing the chess match unfolding beneath. The corporate language. Perhaps we should focus on immediate concerns. The Singapore team expects comprehensive technical documentation tomorrow. We should ensure all materials are consistent with what they've already seen. Absolutely, I agreed. Consistency is essential. The technical documentation package has been prepared according to firm standards, including complete development history and authentication protocols as required by our ISO certification. This reference to international standards cleverly positioned the attribution markers as compliance requirements rather than personal assertions. Jefferson's expression remained calculated, but a new wariness entered his assessment. I'd like to review the technical documentation package before tomorrow's session. Send it to my office this afternoon. Of course, you're already listed as a reviewer on the distribution protocol, I responded. The package includes blockchain verification records as required by our cybersecurity compliance framework, along with complete development progression documentation. The strategic mention of blockchain verification shifted the dynamic subtly. Jefferson's expertise lay in client relationships and business development, not technical implementation or cybersecurity protocols. The reference positioned the attribution markers within technical domains where his authority was less absolute, constraining his ability to demand modifications without revealing his limited understanding of the underlying mechanisms. Blockchain. Verification isn't standard protocol for internal methodologies, Jefferson noted, attempting to regain conversational control. That level of external validation seems unnecessary for proprietary systems. Actually, blockchain verification became standard for Class A methodologies under the updated security protocol implemented last quarter, I countered, referencing an actual policy update that few senior partners bothered to review in detail. The volatility model's regulatory implications required Class A compliance, which includes immutable development records and attribution verification. Marcus nodded uncertainly, caught between supporting Jefferson and avoiding contradicting, a policy he hadn't thoroughly reviewed. The compliance requirements have become more stringent, particularly for methodologies with potential regulatory touchpoints. Jefferson recognized the shifting terrain. What had begun as a simple attribution adjustment was encountering unexpected technical and compliance complications specifically designed to prevent such adjustments. His expression revealed recalculation rather than retreat. Compliance requirements notwithstanding, client presentations should emphasize corporate capabilities rather than individual contributions, he maintained, attempting to separate the technical attribution from the client-facing positioning. Tomorrow's technical session should focus on implementation methodology, not development history. The technical team from Meridian specifically requested comprehensive provenance documentation, I noted, introducing the client's expectations as an additional constraint. Mr. Liang emphasized the importance of transparent development records for their compliance requirements. The attribution protocols align with their due diligence standards. This reference to client expectations created a new complication for Jefferson's position. Modifying attribution against explicitly stated client requirements would create business risk beyond internal politics. His expression acknowledged this constraint without verbally conceding the point. Ensure the technical documentation emphasizes Blake Consulting's institutional development framework, Jefferson directed, attempting to maintain some control over the narrative. Individual contributions should be contextualized within the firm's broader intellectual property architecture. The documentation follows standard attribution hierarchy, I confirmed, the carefully chosen wording appearing to accept his direction while actually maintaining the embedded provenance records. All development components are properly situated within Blake Consulting's ownership framework while maintaining accurate attribution chains as required by ISO compliance standards. Jefferson stood, signaling the conversation's conclusion while preserving his authority position. I expect a briefing before tomorrow's technical session. We should align on presentation approach to ensure messaging consistency. I've already scheduled a pre-meeting briefing, I replied, my preparation extending to anticipating this very request. The calendar invitation includes the technical implementation team and compliance oversight as required for Class A methodology transfer. The inclusion of compliance oversight in the pre-meeting briefing represented another subtle constraint on Jefferson's ability to modify attribution. Their presence would require any changes to follow documented processes rather than verbal directives, creating additional witnesses to any attribution adjustment attempts. As Jefferson and Marcus departed, the initial confrontation concluded in tactical stalemate. Jefferson had maintained his authority position without securing explicit agreement to attribution modification. I had defended the authentication protocols without direct challenge to Jefferson's authority. The battle lines were drawn in carefully, coded corporate language that maintained professional decorum while establishing unmistakable opposition. The next phase would unfold during the technical documentation review, where the comprehensive blockchain verification records would reveal the volatility model's complete development history in immutable timestamp detail. Jefferson would discover that the attribution markers displayed during the client presentation represented merely the visible surface of a much more comprehensive attribution protection system embedded throughout the methodology. What had begun as a standard attribution adjustment following Blake Consulting's established pattern had encountered an unexpected resistance framework specifically designed to prevent such adjustment. The confrontation had shifted from the expected power imbalance between senior partner and analyst to a more complex terrain where technical architecture, compliance requirements, and client expectations created constraints on Jefferson's usual approach. The initial confrontation hadn't resolved the attribution conflict, but had established the battlefield for what would follow. Jefferson's calculating expression as he departed revealed recognition that this situation differed from previous appropriations. that he faced not just another junior analyst, but a carefully prepared opposition that had anticipated his standard tactics and implemented specific countermeasures. The volatility model's attribution protection didn't rely on corporate authority or personal confrontation, but on architectural design, compliance requirements, and immutable verification records. It represented a fundamental challenge not just to this specific appropriation attempt, but to the entire pattern of attribution adjustment that had defined Jefferson's advancement strategy throughout his career at Blake Consulting. The technical implementation meeting was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. in Blake Consulting's Advanced Visualization Suite, a space specifically designed for detailed methodology presentations with multiple display screens, secure network connections, and comprehensive recording capabilities for compliance purposes. I arrived 45 minutes early to ensure all systems were properly configured, particularly the secure connection to Quantum Seal's verification servers that would play a crucial role in today's proceedings. At precisely 8:30 a.m., Samuel Liang from Meridian Holdings arrived, unaccompanied by his colleagues, and 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting time. His early appearance was expected. We had arranged this private conversation through carefully worded messages that maintained professional propriety, while establishing a separate communication channel outside Blake Consulting's standard client. Protocols. "Good morning, Thompson," Samuel greeted me with a polite nod as the security system logged his entry. "I thought it might be valuable to discuss some technical specifications before the formal session begins." "Of course, Mr. Liang. I've prepared some additional documentation regarding the authentication protocols that appeared during yesterday's presentation." I activated the room's privacy mode, which temporarily suspended the automatic recording system while maintaining an encrypted log of the suspension as required by compliance regulations. Samuel's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes conveyed understanding of the unusual circumstance. Those authentication markers raised several questions among our technical team, particularly the blockchain verification timestamps that appeared during the demonstration. The volatility model incorporates comprehensive provenance verification as a core architectural component, I explained, bringing up the relevant technical documentation on the main display. This feature ensures implementation consistency and prevents unauthorized modification of critical algorithmic elements. Samuel studied the displayed information with the focused attention of someone with deep technical expertise. Not surprising given his background in computational finance before joining Meridian's executive team. 18 months of documented development milestones, each with blockchain verification, remarkably comprehensive for an internal methodology. Blake Consulting maintains rigorous development standards for Class A methodologies, I replied, the careful wording acknowledging corporate ownership while emphasizing the systematic development record that established clear attribution. Samuel turned from the display to face me directly. "Thompson, let's speak candidly while we have privacy. Yesterday's presentation contained significant discrepancies between presenter claims and system attribution markers. As Meridian's technical director, I need to understand exactly what we're implementing before proceeding further." This direct approach represented exactly why Samuel had been the perfect alliance partner for this situation. His technical background allowed him to recognize the attribution discrepancy immediately, while his position at Meridian created legitimate business justification for requesting clarification. The volatility model was developed through my research. Over the past 18 months, I confirmed, switching to a more direct communication style now that the groundwork had been established. The blockchain verification records confirm this development timeline and provenance. Blake Consulting owns the methodology under standard employment terms, but the attribution displayed during yesterday's presentation was inconsistent with the actual development history. Samuel nodded, unsurprised by this confirmation. I suspected as much when I saw the authentication markers. Jefferson Blake presented the methodology as his personal innovation, rather than acknowledging its actual development source. Blake Consulting sometimes employs unconventional attribution practices for client-facing presentations, I noted. the diplomatic phrasing concealing a more direct description of systematic intellectual appropriation. This creates a significant complication for Meridian, Samuel replied, his expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. Our implementation requires absolute clarity regarding methodology provenance and development history. Regulatory compliance demands complete transparency in attribution chains, particularly for financial modeling systems. This regulatory requirement wasn't merely convenient, but absolutely legitimate. Financial services firms operated under strict governance frameworks that required comprehensive documentation of all analytical methodologies, including clear development provenance. Any discrepancy between presented attribution and actual development history created potential compliance violations that could result in significant penalties. I anticipated this concern, I acknowledged, accessing a secure server through my personal authentication protocols. I've prepared complete development documentation, including blockchain-verified milestone records that establish the volatility model's provenance without ambiguity. The main screen displayed a comprehensive development timeline: 18 months of documented research, prototype iterations, testing phases, and implementation refinements. Each milestone carried blockchain verification timestamps that couldn't be altered or backdated, creating an immutable record of the methodology's evolution from concept to functional system. This is exactly what our compliance team needs, Samuel confirmed, studying the documentation with professional appreciation. But it contradicts yesterday's presentation attribution substantially. How do you suggest we proceed with implementation, given this discrepancy? The question represented the pivotal moment in our strategic alliance, the transition from identification of the attribution problem to implementation of the solution. Meridian has legitimate business requirements for accurate attribution documentation. Your compliance framework requires transparency regarding methodology development. These requirements create a natural opportunity to correct the attribution record through standard business processes rather than confrontational means. Samuel understood immediately. So rather than directly challenging the presentation claims, we simply proceed with implementation based on verified development documentation. The attribution correction occurs through compliance necessity rather than personal assertion. Precisely. Blake Consulting values the Meridian relationship too highly to reject legitimate compliance requirements. When your team requests comprehensive attribution documentation as part of standard implementation protocols, the firm will need to provide accurate records that inevitably reveal the actual development history. This approach represented the carefully constructed core of my strategy, using client compliance requirements as the mechanism for attribution correction rather than direct confrontation with Jefferson. It transformed the situation from an internal power struggle to an external business necessity, leveraging Meridian's legitimate regulatory requirements to enforce attribution accuracy. Samuel nodded appreciatively. Elegant solution. Our compliance team will require complete development documentation as standard procedure. The blockchain verification ensures this documentation will necessarily reflect accurate attribution. The correction emerges through established business protocols rather than personal conflict. The approach maintains professional relationships while ensuring accurate attribution, I confirmed. Meridian receives properly documented methodology for compliance purposes. Blake Consulting preserves an important client relationship and development attribution aligns with actual history rather than presentation claims. The alliance with Samuel wasn't based on personal friendship or backdoor arrangements, but on aligned professional interests. Meridian genuinely required accurate methodology documentation for compliance purposes. My interest in proper attribution aligned perfectly with their regulatory requirements, creating a natural partnership that served legitimate business purposes for both parties. Samuel checked his watch, noting the approaching meeting time. The formal session begins soon. How do you anticipate Jefferson will respond when our compliance team requests comprehensive development documentation? He'll likely attempt to provide sanitized records that maintain his attribution claim while satisfying surface-level requirements, I predicted, having studied Jefferson's previous patterns extensively. However, the blockchain verification makes this impossible without creating documented fraud. The verified records establish immutable development history that can't be retrospectively modified. And if he attempts to dismiss the verification records as unnecessary technical details? Samuel asked, probing the strategy's resilience to potential counter-arguments. Meridian's compliance requirements provide the perfect response. Financial services regulations explicitly require transparent methodology provenance, claiming verification. Records are unnecessary would directly contradict regulatory standards that Meridian must maintain. It creates an unwinnable position: either provide accurate attribution or render the methodology unusable for compliance reasons. Samuel nodded with professional appreciation for the strategic framework. Understanding Blake Consulting's ownership, while maintaining accurate development attribution, maintains everyone's essential interests. The firm preserves its intellectual property rights while proper attribution is established through standard business protocols. The alliance with Samuel and Meridian Holdings represented a crucial component of my attribution protection strategy. Without directly challenging corporate authority or creating confrontational attribution disputes, it established a client-driven business necessity for accurate development documentation. Jefferson's usual attribution adjustment tactics wouldn't work against regulatory compliance requirements from a nine-figure client relationship. As we concluded our preliminary discussion and prepared for the formal meeting, Samuel offered a final observation. You've approached this situation with remarkable strategic foresight. Most people in your position would have chosen direct confrontation or simply accepted the attribution reassignment. Direct confrontation rarely succeeds against established power structures, I replied. And accepting inaccurate attribution contradicts the fundamental integrity of intellectual development. This approach maintains professional relationships while ensuring accurate recognition through legitimate business processes. The formal meeting began precisely on schedule, with the Singapore team entering alongside Jefferson, Marcus, and Blake Consulting's implementation specialists. Jefferson's confident demeanor suggested he believed the attribution issues from yesterday's presentation had been resolved or contained. His opening remarks emphasized corporate capabilities and institutional expertise, carefully avoiding specific attribution claims while maintaining the impression of firm-level innovation. Blake Consulting appreciates Meridian's interest in our volatility modeling system, Jefferson began, his tone carrying the practiced authority that had served him well in countless client engagements. Today's technical session will establish implementation parameters and integration requirements for your existing analytical framework. Samuel nodded professionally before introducing an unexpected participant. Before we proceed, I'd like to introduce Eliza Rodriguez, Meridian's Chief Compliance Officer. Given the regulatory implications of volatility modeling in our industry, Eliza will oversee implementation documentation to ensure alignment with our governance framework. Eliza Rodriguez carried herself with the precise professionalism of someone responsible for regulatory compliance in a highly scrutinized industry. Her presence represented another carefully arranged component of our strategic alliance, though Jefferson couldn't know that her participation had been scheduled based on my recommendation to Samuel during our earlier correspondence. Thank you for including me in this session, Eliza stated, her tone politely firm. Financial modeling systems require comprehensive provenance documentation under current regulatory frameworks. I'll need complete development records, including authenticated attribution chains for all core methodological components. Jefferson maintained his composed expression, but I noticed the slight tension in his posture as he recognized the implication of this compliance requirement. Of course, Blake Consulting maintains comprehensive documentation for all proprietary methodologies. We'll provide appropriate records for implementation purposes. Excellent, Eliza replied, opening a document on her tablet. Our compliance requirements specify blockchain-verified development records with authenticated attribution for all analytical methodologies integrated into financial decision systems. I understand from yesterday's presentation that such verification records already exist for the volatility model. The reference to yesterday's authentication markers cleverly positioned the compliance request as a natural follow-up to information already disclosed, rather than a new requirement. Jefferson glanced briefly in my direction, his expression revealing calculation rather than concern. Our technical team can provide appropriate documentation for compliance purposes, Jefferson confirmed, his careful wording attempting to preserve room for attribution adjustment. We'll ensure Meridian receives all necessary records for regulatory requirements. Eliza nodded professionally while establishing a critical specification. To clarify our needs, we require the original blockchain-verified development records with timestamps and authenticated attribution as displayed during yesterday's demonstration. Our regulators specifically prohibit reconstructed or summarized documentation for methodology provenance. This requirement effectively eliminated Jefferson's potential workaround. Reconstructed documentation that modified attribution would contradict the blockchain verification records already disclosed during the presentation. The compliance framework required original verification rather than derived summaries, preventing attribution adjustment through documentation manipulation. Of course, Jefferson agreed, his options constrained by legitimate business requirements. Thompson will coordinate with your team to provide the appropriate verification records. The strategic alliance had achieved its first objective, establishing client-driven business necessity for accurate attribution documentation. Jefferson couldn't reject Meridian's compliance requirements without jeopardizing the client relationship. Yet fulfilling those requirements would necessarily reveal the volatility model's actual development history through immutable blockchain records. The formal session proceeded with technical discussions regarding implementation timelines, integration requirements, and performance parameters. Throughout these conversations, I maintained appropriate professional focus on methodology functionality rather than attribution concerns. The strategic alliance with Samuel and Meridian's compliance team had transformed the attribution correction from personal assertion to regulatory requirement, allowing the process to unfold through established business protocols. 2 hours into the session, the pivotal moment arrived as Eliza requested formal presentation of the blockchain verification records. Now that we've established implementation parameters, we should review the development provenance documentation. Our technical team will need to integrate these verification records into our compliance framework before proceeding with system integration. Jefferson gestured toward me with practiced corporate delegation. Thompson will guide you through the verification records as our technical implementation lead. His wording carefully positioned me as implementing established methodology rather than acknowledging development attribution, a final attempt to maintain his narrative within the constraints of compliance requirements. As I accessed the blockchain verification system through my authenticated credentials, the main display filled with the comprehensive development history I had systematically documented over 18 months. Each milestone appeared with immutable timestamps, verified attribution, and authenticated development progression that established unambiguous provenance for the volatility model. The verification record begins 18 months ago with initial concept development, I explained, maintaining professional focus on technical documentation rather than attribution politics. Each subsequent milestone has been verified through QuantumSeal's blockchain protocol, creating immutable provenance documentation that satisfies financial services regulatory requirements. The displayed records told their own story without requiring explicit attribution claims. The blockchain verification established clear development history that directly contradicted Jefferson's presentation narrative while satisfying Meridian's legitimate compliance requirements. The attribution correction was occurring through documented evidence rather than confrontational assertions, exactly as my strategy had intended. Eliza nodded with professional approval. These records provide exactly the provenance documentation our compliance framework requires. The blockchain verification ensures methodology integrity throughout the implementation process. Jefferson maintained his composed demeanor, but the subtle tension in his expression revealed recognition that the attribution narrative had shifted irrevocably. The blockchain records established development history that couldn't be retrospectively modified without creating documented fraud. The strategic alliance with Meridian's compliance team had transformed attribution from subjective corporate politics to objective regulatory requirement. The implementation session concluded with formal transfer of the verification records to Meridian's compliance team, a standard business process that nevertheless represented the culmination of my carefully constructed attribution protection strategy. The volatility model's development history had been established through immutable documentation within legitimate business protocols, correcting Jefferson's attribution claims without direct confrontation or corporate conflict. As the Singapore team departed with comprehensive implementation documentation, the attribution reality had been irrevocably established through blockchain-verified records rather than presentation claims. The strategic alliance had accomplished its purpose, ensuring accurate attribution through client-driven business necessity rather than internal power struggles. The next phase of my attribution protection strategy unfolded 3 days after the Meridian Holdings implementation meeting. Jefferson had maintained professional cordiality following the blockchain verification revelation, neither acknowledging the attribution discrepancy nor attempting to reassert his creation claims. His calculated retreat suggested strategic reconsideration, rather than acceptance, a temporary withdrawal to assess options rather than concession of the attribution battle. Blake Consulting's weekly executive briefing provided the perfect venue for the next strategic move. This standing meeting brought together department heads, senior partners, and project leaders to align corporate messaging and review major client engagements. The briefing's formal structure and documented minutes created an official record of all discussions, making it ideal for establishing institutional recognition of accurate attribution without direct confrontation. I arrived early, selecting a seat that positioned me within Jefferson's line of sight without claiming undue prominence. The attribution correction would emerge through natural business processes rather than personal assertion, maintaining professional decorum while establishing accurate recognition. My preparation for this meeting had been as meticulous as every other aspect of the protection strategy, with documentation organized for maximum impact through minimum confrontation. As executives filtered into the conference room, I noted the presence of Diane Winters from Legal Affairs, whose earlier concerns about patent attribution had revealed her as someone who valued proper documentation over political considerations. Her participation would prove valuable when the discussion inevitably turned to intellectual property implications of the Meridian Holdings engagement. Jefferson entered precisely on schedule, his tailored appearance and confident demeanor showing no indication of the attribution complications that had emerged during the implementation meeting. He took his customary position at the head of the conference table, exchanging brief pleasantries with senior partners while systematically establishing the authority hierarchy that defined Blake Consulting's corporate culture. "Let's begin with major client developments," Jefferson announced once preliminary matters had been addressed. "Marcus, update us on the Meridian Holdings implementation." Marcus shifted slightly in his chair, his expression revealing discomfort with the attribution complications that had emerged during the implementation meeting. "The technical onboarding is proceeding according to schedule. Meridian's compliance team has completed initial review of the methodology documentation and approved integration with their analytical framework." Jefferson nodded with professional satisfaction. "Excellent. The volatility model represents a significant advancement in our predictive analytics portfolio. I expect full implementation will create opportunities for similar engagements in the financial services sector." His careful wording maintained the corporate attribution narrative without making specific creation claims that would directly contradict the blockchain verification records now in Meridian's possession. It represented a subtle retreat from personal attribution while preserving institutional ownership. A strategic compromise that Jefferson likely believed would resolve the situation without explicit correction. The meeting agenda provided the perfect opening for the next phase of my strategy. New intellectual property registrations appeared as the third item, a standard topic that typically received minimal attention beyond procedural acknowledgement of patent applications and trademark filings. Today, however, this routine agenda item would serve as the vehicle for formal attribution correction. When the discussion reached intellectual property matters, I contributed with deliberate professionalism. The technical implementation team has prepared documentation for patent filing on the volatility model methodology. The blockchain verification records established during Meridian's compliance review provide comprehensive development history that strengthens our intellectual property position. This contribution introduced the attribution issue through legitimate business process, rather than personal assertion. By positioning the blockchain records as beneficial for patent protection, it transformed accurate attribution from a personal concern to a corporate asset, aligning my interests with Blake Consulting's institutional objectives. Diane from Legal Affairs engaged immediately, her professional responsibilities compelling involvement regardless of corporate politics. The blockchain verification would indeed strengthen our patent position by establishing clear development provenance. We should incorporate these records in the patent application to prevent potential challenges. Jefferson maintained his composed expression, but I noticed the calculated assessment in his gaze as he recognized the strategic repositioning of the attribution issue. Of course, our patent filings should reflect appropriate development documentation. Thompson, coordinate with legal to ensure all relevant records are incorporated in the application. His response represented another strategic retreat, acknowledging the necessity of accurate documentation for patent purposes while avoiding explicit recognition of the attribution correction. It maintained his authority position while creating space for the attribution adjustment to occur through established business processes rather than personal confrontation. The next phase of my strategy activated when Marcus attempted to preserve some element of Jefferson's attribution claim. The patent application should emphasize the strategic direction that shaped the volatility model's development. Jefferson's conceptual framework guided the technical implementation that Thompson executed. This attempt to position Jefferson as the conceptual architect while relegating me to mere technical execution had been anticipated in my preparation. Rather than directly challenging the characterization, I responded by activating the next layer of documented evidence. The development documentation includes conceptual evolution records that would strengthen our intellectual property position, I noted, retrieving a specific file from my organized materials. The blockchain verification includes initial concept, mapping from 18 months ago, with subsequent refinement milestones that demonstrate the methodology's evolution from theoretical framework to functional system. The conference room display showed the conceptual documentation, blockchain-verified records of the volatility model's evolution from initial theoretical questions through progressive refinement into functional methodology. The timestamps and attribution were unmistakable, establishing clear provenance for both conceptual framework and technical implementation, without requiring explicit claims or confrontational assertions. Diane studied the displayed documentation with professional interest. This conceptual evolution record is exactly what we need for comprehensive patent protection. It establishes both theoretical foundation and implementation methodology under consistent development attribution. Jefferson observed the displayed evidence with the calculated assessment of someone recognizing an unwinnable position. The blockchain-verified conceptual documentation eliminated the potential compromise of claiming strategic direction while conceding technical implementation. The evidence established comprehensive development attribution from initial concept through final execution, all verified through immutable records that couldn't be retrospectively modified. The volatility model represents a significant advancement for Blake Consulting, Jefferson stated. pivoting to corporate attribution rather than personal claims. Our intellectual property protocols should incorporate the most robust protection available, including these verification records. This statement represented another strategic retreat, shifting from individual attribution to institutional ownership while acknowledging the necessity of accurate documentation. It maintained Jefferson's authority position while creating space for attribution correction through standard business processes rather than personal confrontation. The meeting continued with discussion of implementation timelines, potential application in other client engagements, and resource allocation for further development. Throughout these conversations, the attribution reality established through blockchain verification remained unchallenged, gradually transforming from controversial revelation to acknowledged fact through natural business processes. The formal minutes drafted during the meeting documented comprehensive blockchain verification of volatility model development from initial concept through implementation methodology to be incorporated in patent application and intellectual property registration. This official record established institutional recognition of accurate attribution without requiring confrontational assertions or explicit correction of previous claims. The attribution protection strategy advanced to its next phase 2 days later, when Meridian Holdings requested a joint press release announcing implementation of the volatility model within their analytical framework. Such announcements were standard practice for significant client engagements, providing mutual benefit through publicity for both service provider and client. The press release creation process would establish public attribution through standard corporate communications rather than internal confrontation. As Blake Consulting's technical implementation lead for the Meridian engagement, I was included in the distribution list for the draft press release. The initial version prepared by the marketing department contained language clearly influenced by Jefferson's presentation. The proprietary volatility model, developed under the strategic direction of Jefferson Blake, represents a significant advancement in predictive market analytics. Rather than directly challenging this characterization, I responded through established business protocols by offering standard technical review comments. To ensure alignment with the implementation documentation provided to Meridian's compliance team, we should reference the blockchain-verified development records that support their regulatory requirements. This feedback repositioned the attribution issue as a matter of client alignment rather than personal recognition, creating legitimate business necessity for accuracy through established corporate processes. The blockchain verification records provided to Meridian's compliance team established an external reference point that couldn't be disregarded without creating potential client complications. The marketing department, concerned primarily with accuracy rather than internal politics, revised the press release to align with the documented evidence. The proprietary volatility model, developed by Blake Consulting's quantitative analytics team with blockchain-verified methodology documentation, provides Meridian Holdings with regulatory-compliant predictive capabilities. This revision shifted attribution from individual claims to team recognition, while acknowledging the blockchain verification that established actual development history. It represented another incremental correction through standard business processes rather than confrontational demands, gradually aligning public messaging with documented reality. Jefferson received the revised press release through standard approval channels. His response revealed continuing strategic adaptation rather than attribution confrontation. The release should emphasize Blake Consulting's institutional capabilities rather than focusing on development specifics. Our corporate messaging prioritizes firm-level expertise over individual contributions. This guidance maintained his authority position while shifting further from personal attribution claims toward institutional ownership. Another strategic retreat that preserved corporate hierarchy, while acknowledging the impossibility of maintaining his original attribution assertion against blockchain-verified evidence. The final press release, approved through standard corporate channels including legal review, established public attribution through carefully balanced language. The volatility model, developed through Blake Consulting's quantitative research initiative with blockchain-verified methodology documentation, provides Meridian Holdings with regulatory-compliant predictive capabilities. This public statement completed another phase of the attribution protection strategy, establishing external recognition through standard business communications rather than confrontational demands. The press release would be distributed to financial publications, industry analysts, and potential clients, creating public record of the development attribution without requiring explicit correction of Jefferson's previous claims. The comprehensive attribution protection strategy continued unfolding through established business processes rather than personal confrontation. Each phase built upon the previous foundation, gradually transforming accurate attribution from contested claim to acknowledged reality through legitimate corporate channels. The blockchain verification records established immutable evidence of development history. Meridian's compliance requirements created business necessity for accurate attribution documentation. The patent application process incorporated comprehensive development records for intellectual property protection. Executive meeting minutes documented institutional recognition of development. Provenance. The press release established public attribution through standard corporate communications. Each component operated through legitimate business processes rather than confrontational demands, gradually aligning corporate recognition with documented reality without requiring direct challenges to authority structures. The attribution correction emerged through natural institutional functions rather than personal conflict, preserving professional relationships while establishing accurate recognition. Jefferson's strategic adaptation throughout this process revealed sophisticated understanding of corporate dynamics. Rather than directly contesting the increasingly documented attribution reality, he progressively retreated from personal claims toward institutional ownership, preserving his authority position while acknowledging the impossibility of maintaining his original attribution assertion against accumulating evidence. The attribution protection strategy succeeded not through confrontational demands but through systematic alignment of personal recognition with corporate interests. By positioning accurate attribution as beneficial for client relationships, intellectual property protection, and regulatory compliance, the strategy transformed what could have been dismissed as personal concern into legitimate business necessity. Blake Consulting maintained its valuable client relationship with Meridian Holdings. The volatility model advanced toward patent protection with comprehensive documentation that strengthened the firm's intellectual property position. Regulatory compliance requirements were satisfied through accurate attribution records, and most importantly, the development attribution gradually aligned with documented reality through established business processes rather than disruptive confrontation. The attribution correction occurred systematically through legitimate corporate channels, gradually transforming from contested claim to acknowledged reality without requiring explicit admission of the original misattribution. Jefferson preserved his authority position through strategic pivoting from personal claims to institutional ownership, while accurate development attribution became established through documented evidence and standard business processes. This approach succeeded where direct confrontation would likely have failed, using systematic alignment of interests rather than adversarial demands to achieve attribution correction. The strategy respected corporate hierarchy while establishing accurate recognition, maintaining professional relationships while ensuring proper attribution through legitimate business processes rather than personal conflict. As the final blockchain, verification records were integrated into Blake Consulting's official documentation, Jefferson's strategy shifted completely. During the quarterly leadership meeting, he publicly acknowledged my exceptional contribution to the volatility model, while announcing my promotion to Director of Quantitative Analytics. This wasn't mere acceptance of defeat, but a calculated move to position himself as a talent developer rather than admit to attempted appropriation. The volatility model became Blake Consulting's most successful product, generating over $50 million in implementation contracts within the first year. My name appeared on the patent application, the blockchain verification serving as undeniable proof of authorship. More importantly, the firm established new attribution protocols requiring blockchain verification for all major methodologies, protecting future innovations from similar appropriation attempts. Jefferson and I maintained professional cordiality, neither ever directly addressing what had occurred. He focused on client relationships while I led methodology development, our forced partnership ultimately benefiting both our careers. 3 years later, when I received an offer to head quantitative research at a prestigious firm, Jefferson personally negotiated my retention package, including equity partnership. Perhaps his final acknowledgement that intellectual capital requires proper recognition and compensation. The lesson wasn't about winning a confrontation, but about architecting accountability systems that make truth the path of least resistance. Sometimes the perfect professional revenge isn't about personal vindication, but about changing the systems that enable misconduct in the first place. If this story of strategic patience and methodical justice resonated with you, make sure you're subscribe to our channel for more tales of corporate accountability and professional vindication. Your support helps us continue bringing these hidden stories to light.